and the senior public servants is really important. Secondly, I think it illustrated a few things. I think there was a great sense of confidence in the advice given by Treasury, in the advice coming from the bureaucrats, based on historical memory and intellectual confidence. And I think the Prime Minister was particularly influenced by Ken Henry and his advice, go early, go hard, go households, go temporary, etc. So the moral here for me is the role of strong institutions who have historical memory and who have intellectual quality. I mean, tied up with this is understanding the Great Depression, understanding 20th century economic history over many decades, understanding more immediate Australian history. I think Treasury was influenced by the One Nation experience, Paul Keating's One Nation package, introduced in February 1992 to combat the early 1990s recession, when I think the takeout from the Treasury was that the action was too late, the stimulus was too small, it wasn't properly targeted, and the impact of the stimulus was still at work after John Howard became Prime Minister in 1996. And so I think that a lot of the lessons from that were at work in the advice given to the Rudd government last year. So I think intellectual quality, historical memory are really important. Also, if you look at what happened, crisis is rarely just a one-dimensional affair. This was a multiple crisis and it was a multiple response from the Rudd government. So they had to first of all protect against meltdown. So they gave bank guarantees. Then they were thinking in the medium term about trying to counteract the downturn. So they were looking at medium-term stimuluses in a fiscal and monetary sense. They had a clear idea of the design, at least the design in terms of being targeted and temporary. They weren't interested, as far as I can see, in an agenda which related to productivity. They were interested in a classic Keynesian stimulus agenda. And what we saw in the budget in May this year was we saw a framework for the exit strategy, where Treasury, to be fair, having given this advice to the government, persuaded the government to accept the framework for an exit strategy, which was very important, which is a tough exit strategy in terms of restrictions on public outlays and an agenda for getting back to budget surplus. So in that sense, there was a recognition of the consequences of what they were doing in terms of putting in place a framework for an exit. So I think all this is a very interesting study of crisis. Now there's another example of crisis, which is another economic issue, which is a different sort of crisis. It's what I called a politician-induced crisis. And of course, we go back to our old friend, who, in a combination of calculation and panic, on the 14th of May 1986 warned about a banana republic. Paul Keating, as Treasurer, speaking from some isolated place in Victoria on a wall telephone to Sydney radio jockey John Laws, scared the bejesus out of Bob Hawke and most of the right-wing apparatchiks of the Labor Party, having declared for a long period of time that the economy was in pretty good shape, suddenly announced one morning that Australia was facing the prospect of becoming a banana republic. It could never happen today. This is old-fashioned politics. This is baring the soul. This is a spontaneous outburst. This is authentic. There's no spin about this at all. Probably There was a lot of panic about it, which Keating later on segued into a brilliant story that he'd orchestrated, this dramatic change in expectations. And of course he had some very, very considered advice. Senior Treasury bureaucrat David Morgan had told him, "Treasurer, we're buggered." And Keating acted on that advice, of course. This was a current account deficit crisis, and what happened, Keating, of course, said, even John Laws could discern during the interview that something pretty important was happening. So when Keating finished, Laws said, "Well, so we're in trouble." And Keating replied, "Well, there you are. At this point, you're a banana republic." The dollar fell 3 cents US within hours. Thinking about this, you know, some treasurers would have probably got sacked for this sort of gross irresponsibility and incompetence. But we remember this as an heroic moment. What happened was that after Bob Hawke recovered and was given the smelling salts and came to and got through the soliloquies in his office about how Keating had gone mad, we saw some substantial policy changes, a much tougher wages policy, wages discounting, and a much tougher fiscal policy framework, very significant quantum changes in the budget. So what we actually got was we got a politician changing expectations and then a major government policy response, major government macro policy response, and the political dividend was, hey, the government looked like a bunch of heroes, they were taking decisive action, these were brave guys, and Paul Keating looked as though he was in control and really running the country, and he'd manipulated everybody, and he was a master of the process. So this was another form of crisis. Now, the best sort of crisis is what I call a fast action crisis. Now, one reasonably good example of this, although it got a little bit protracted, was John Howard and the gun laws after the massacre in Port Arthur, and there was a public mood for change. And the reason this is such a good crisis is that the response, and I don't want to oversimplify this, but the response was relatively simple. After John Howard rang Senior National Party Minister John Anderson and asked him if he had any guns, and Anderson said, "Yes, I got 21 guns and rifles in my house." And there were difficulties with the states, and Tim Fischer in particular and Anderson did a sterling job. They had great trouble with their constituency, great trouble, and like a lot of issues, they had to wear the flak. But this was a very good example in over a period of several months of a response to a crisis in relatively fast terms. Then there's the existential crisis. Howard in Washington at 9/11. This is a tricky crisis, filled with all sorts of traps. It was an historical moment, a moment that transformed world history, and the politicians move real quick. They're carried along by the momentum, and they make very strong declarations. And Bush spoke with great emotion and certainty, and Howard was with him. And Howard basically made a unilateral commitment as Prime Minister in Washington that Australia would fight with the United States in its retaliatory action. Now, this is a classic exercise in prime ministerial power and discretion. Howard didn't get on the phone and say, "Look, I'd like to have a hook-up with cabinet ministers just to see what we think about this, and can we get the bureaucrats to prepare a few papers for us?" He acted. He acted drawing upon his authority as Prime Minister, and he made